The day turning meant death, the sky where math meant you die at 7:32 a.m. on February 10th, 1942. The sky above the Pacific wasn't just blue, it was a countdown. Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat in the cockpit of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, scanning the horizon with the kind of tension that didn't come from fear alone, but from knowing the numbers were already against him. 6 Japanese Zeros were diving fast, slicing through the morning light like knives, and behind him 3 other Wildcats held formation, trusting him, depending on him, waiting for an answer he didn't yet have. 90 seconds, that's all they had, 90 seconds before those Zeros got within range, before the turning fight began, before the same pattern played out again. Because by early 1942, air combat in the Pacific had become predictable in the worst possible way. An American pilot sees a Zero, he turns to engage. The Zero turns tighter, gets on his tail, fires, and the American never makes it home. It wasn't theory anymore, it was statistics written in funerals. 43 Wildcats lost in turning fights, 43 pilots who trusted their training, 43 men who followed doctrine and died because the Zero was everything the Wildcat wasn't. Faster, climb tighter, turn, lighter frame. It could outmaneuver anything the Americans had in the sky, and Worset was flown by pilots with years of combat experience. Men who had already mastered aerial combat over China long before America entered the war. They knew exactly what would happen when a Wildcat tried to turn at them. They were counting on it, and that's what made the situation so brutal. Both sides knew the outcome before the fight even started. The math was simple. 4 Wildcats versus 6 Zeros wasn't just a disadvantage. It was a death sentence, and yet command kept repeating the same orders. Avoid turning fights, disengage if possible, run when outmatched. But in the sky, running wasn't just tactical, it was burden. Running meant leaving your wingman behind. Running meant watching a Zero latch onto your friend's tail while you pulled away to save yourself. And that was something pilots weren't wired to do. Thach knew all of this. He wasn't new, 37 years old, over 200 hours in the Wildcat. But Zero kills against Zeros, not because he lacked skill, but because the fight itself was unwinnable under current tactics. He had watched good pilots try everything, tight turns, dives, climbs, none of it worked. The Zero always ended up behind you, always, and when it did, you had about 14 seconds. 14 seconds before it aligned its guns, 14 seconds before it fired, 14 seconds before you were gone. And that knowledge sat heavy in his chest as those 6 aircraft dropped lower, closing distance, committing to the attack. His hand hovered near the radio, but there was nothing new to say. No new command, no new tactic, just the same choices that had already failed dozens of times before. But something had changed in Thach over the past 3 days. Something small, something almost ridiculous. Because 3 nights earlier, sitting alone in his quarters, far from the roar of engines and gunfire, he had been staring at something no one would have thought mattered: a simple pack of wooden matches, 20 thin sticks in a cardboard sleeve, a gift from home, something ordinary, something quiet. And yet, in that silence, with the weight of dead pilots on his mind, he had started thinking different, not about speed, not about maneuverability, but about patterns, about movement, about how 2 objects could move together instead of separately. He picked up 2 matches and held them parallel. For a moment, they just sat there, side by side, like 2 aircraft flying in formation. Then slowly he moved them, one forward, one back, then crossing again. And something about that motion stuck with him. The matches never separated, they stayed connected, always moving in relation to each other, always covering each other. And suddenly a thought formed, quiet at first, then louder, sharper. What if fighters didn't break apart in combat? What if they stayed linked? What if instead of fighting alone, they fought as one moving system? That idea shouldn't have made sense. It went against everything pilots were taught. Since World War I, fighter doctrine was built on individual engagement. You spotted the enemy, you maneuvered, you fought one-on-one. Formation was for travel, not combat. But what if that was wrong? What if the entire foundation of air combat was flawed against an enemy like the Zero? Thach couldn't shake the thought. He kept moving those matches, watching how they crossed paths, how one could cover the other at the exact moment of vulnerability. And for the first time since the war began, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, a possibility. The idea that shouldn't work now, back in the sky with 6 Zeros diving toward him. That possibility wasn't theory anymore, it was his only option. Standard doctrine said to split formation and fight independently, but Thach knew exactly how that would end. He had seen it too many times. Splitting up meant isolation, meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. So instead of giving the expected command, he hesitated just long enough to make a decision that no American pilot had ever made in combat before. His voice came through the radio, tight but steady. Stay together. There was a brief silence. His wingmen didn't question him, but they knew what that meant. It meant they weren't following protocol. It meant they were about to try something untested, something risky, something that could just as easily get them all killed. The Zeros were now close enough to see clearly, sleek, fast, aggressive. They were already choosing targets, already positioning for the kill. Thach could feel the pressure building. Every instinct screamed at him to formation, to evade individually, to survive the way pilots always had. But instinct was what had gotten 43 men killed, so he pushed it aside. On my mark, we turned toward each other. That was the moment everything changed. Two Wildcats, flying parallel, suddenly banked inward directly toward one another. It looked wrong. It looked dangerous. From the outside, it probably looked like panic, like confusion, like two pilots about to collide midair. And maybe that's exactly what the Zero pilots thought too, because they didn't hesitate. One of them locked onto Thach's wingman, committing fully to the chase, closing fast, confident, predictable. That was the key. Because for the first time in this war, the American pilot being chased didn't turn away. He turned toward his wingman, toward the incoming aircraft, toward what should have been disaster. And as the distance closed 600 yards, 500, 400, the Zero pilot stayed locked in. Focused on the kill, focused on the target in front of him. Not seeing what was coming from the side, not realizing that the geometry of the fight had just changed. At 300 yards, the crossing happened, and suddenly the hunter became exposed. Thach came screaming across the pattern, guns already aligned. The Zero pilot had a split second to react and break off or die. He chose to break, pulled hard, climbed away, abandoning the attack. No shots fired, no kill, just survival. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, an American pilot had escaped a Zero's tail, not by outrunning it, but by outthinking it. The sky shifted because the other Wildcats saw too. They saw the pattern, saw the movement, saw the possibility, and without needing another command, they began to mirror it. Two more aircraft wing crossing, supporting. The Zeros tried again diving, committing, but every time they locked onto one target, another Wildcat cut across their path, forcing them to disengage. The predictable pattern of death was breaking apart in real time. 6 minutes. That's how long the fight lasted. 6 minutes of chaos, of movement, of constant repositioning. 6 minutes where the Zeros couldn't secure a single clean shot. 6 minutes where 4 American pilots, outnumbered, outmatched, refused to die. And when it was over, when the Zeros finally climbed away, something impossible had happened. All 4 Wildcats were still in the air. No losses, no funerals. Just silence on the radio, broken only by heavy breathing and the realization that something had changed forever. Thach didn't celebrate, he didn't cheer, because he knew one success didn't mean victory. It meant questions, it meant resistance, it meant a system that wouldn't accept change easily. But as he turned his aircraft back toward base, one thought stayed locked in his mind. The pattern worked, and if it worked once, it could work again. June 4th, 1942, 9:30 a.m., and the sky above Midway wasn't just crowded, it was overwhelming. A layered battlefield of altitude, speed, and intent, where every second carried the weight of history, and Lieutenant Commander John Thach knew before the first shot was fired that this would not be like the test 3 months earlier, because this time the enemy wasn't probing or experimenting. This time they were executing a full-scale assault, and as he scanned the horizon from 14,000 feet above the USS Yorktown, what he saw wasn't just aircraft, it was formation, discipline, coordination, and numbers that dwarfed his own. 18 HE dive bombers cutting straight toward the carrier, with 12 Mitsubishi A6M0s escorting them in tight protective arcs, and behind him only 4 Wildcats in his immediate section. 4 men again trusting him with their lives. But now the stakes weren't just survival. Now it was the survival of an entire carrier, an entire operation, possibly the turning point of the Pacific War. And the math hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten worse, because while intelligence had warned of even larger numbers, 12 Zeros against 4 Wildcats was still a 3-to-1 disadvantage, still a scenario where traditional doctrine meant certain losses. And yet this time something was different, because Thach wasn't going into this fight empty-handed. He wasn't relying on outdated tactics or blind hope. He had something new, something untested at this scale, but proven enough to risk everything on. And as the Zeros climbed slightly above their formation, preparing to dive, setting up their classic attack pattern of altitude advantage, followed by high-speed engagement, Thach's mind didn't go to fear. It went to geometry, to movement, to those 2 simple matchsticks crossing again and again in his memory, because he understood now that this fight wouldn't be won by matching the Zero's strengths, but by forcing it into a situation where its strengths became liabilities. And as the distance closed and the Japanese formation began to split, 3 Zeros breaking toward him, 4 toward his wingman Bassett, the others continuing toward Yorktown, He didn't hesitate this time, didn't question the risk, didn't consider falling back to standard orders, because he had already seen what standard orders did. He keyed the radio with absolute clarity and said the words that were slowly becoming something more than just an experiment. Weave pattern, execute on my mark. And in that moment, as the sky filled with diving aircraft and converging paths, Thach wasn't just leading 4 fighters anymore. He was about to test whether an idea born from desperation could hold against disciplined, experienced, and coordinated enemy pilots who were just as determined to win. And as he gave the command mark and turned hard toward Bassett, watching his wingman mirror the move perfectly, closing the gap between them as the Zeros committed to their attacks, the airspace itself seemed to tighten, lines crossing, speeds increasing, distances collapsing into seconds, and for a brief instant everything balanced on a single fragile principle. That 2 aircraft moving together could become something greater than the sum of their parts, something unpredictable, something the enemy had not yet fully understood. And as the first Zero lined up behind Thach, confident, aggressive, certain of the outcome as so many had been before, it had no idea that this fight was about to follow a completely different script. One where the target would not run, would not turn away, but would instead lead the hunter directly into danger, into crossfire, into a trap built not from firepower, but from timing and trust. And as the first crossing approached, as 2 Wildcats converged at high speed with only feet separating them, the Zero pilot stayed committed, focused on the kill ahead, unaware that in the next few seconds, everything he believed about air combat would be challenged in a way no training had prepared him for. The moment of crossing came fast and violent, the kind of instant where hesitation meant death, and as Thach and Bassett passed each other at barely 200 feet of separation, banking hard in opposite directions, the Zero chasing Thach suddenly found itself in a position it had never been forced into before. Because instead of a fleeing target, it now faced a second Wildcat cutting across its path with guns already aligned. And Thach didn't wait, didn't second guess. He opened fire the second the angle was right. .50 caliber rounds tearing through the air in a stream of controlled fury, striking the Zero's engine cowling and sending a burst of smoke trailing behind it as the Japanese pilot reacted instinctively, pulling away, breaking off the attack, abandoning what should have been a guaranteed kill. And that single moment rippled through the rest of the engagement because the other Zeros saw it, felt it, realized something was wrong, that these American fighters were not behaving, expected that they weren't separating, weren't isolating themselves, weren't giving the Zeros the one-on-one fights they dominated. Instead, they were moving together, weaving, crossing, covering each other in a pattern that made every attack risky, every commitment uncertain. And as the fight expanded across the sky, other Wildcats began executing the same maneuver, turning toward each other, crossing paths, forcing the Zeros to constantly reassess, constantly break off, constantly lose the advantage they relied on. But the Japanese pilots were not inexperienced. They adapted quickly. 2 of them abandoning the direct chase and instead splitting high and low, attempting to attack from different angles simultaneously, trying to disrupt the weave, to break the coordination, and for a brief, dangerous moment, it worked, because Thach was forced to choose, forced to commit to one threat while exposing himself to another, and as cannon fire ripped past his wing, punching through metal and slicing through the air close enough to be felt rather than seen, the reality of the situation snapped back into focus. The weave was not invincible. It required precision, timing, and constant awareness, and even a slight disruption could create openings. But what mattered was not perfection. What mattered was adaptation. And Thach adapted instantly, abandoning the pure pattern and instead applying its core principle, positioning himself between his wingman and the incoming threat, diving aggressively to intercept the Zero chasing Bassett, closing distance rapidly, lining up the shot with calculated urgency, and when he fired this time, the result was immediate and decisive. The Zero didn't break away, didn't escape. It exploded mid-air, fragments scattering as the aircraft disintegrated under sustained fire, marking Thach's first confirmed kill against a Zero, but more importantly proving that the tactic didn't just defend, it could also destroy. And even as Bassett's death, Wildcat began trailing smoke, forced to withdraw toward Yorktown. The psychological shift in the battle was undeniable, because now the Zeros were no longer hunting freely. They were reacting, adjusting, hesitating, and hesitation in combat was as dangerous as any bullet. And as the remaining Wildcats regrouped and continued the weave, forcing multiple disengagements, protecting each other long enough to push the attackers away from the carrier, the outcome became something no one would have predicted months earlier. The Zeros, still numerically superior, still technically more maneuverable, began to withdraw, climbing away, breaking contact, not because they were defeated outright, but because the fight had become inefficient, costly, unpredictable, and in war. Even the most aggressive pilots avoid fights that no longer guarantee results. And as the sky slowly cleared and the immediate threat to Yorktown diminished, Thach took a moment to scan his remaining aircraft, checking positions, counting survivors, and once again, against the expectations of every previous engagement, his pilots were still there, damaged but alive, shaken but flying, and in that moment, hovering above the vast expanse of ocean where so many had fallen before, Thach understood something that went far beyond a single battle. The weave was no longer just an idea, no longer just a desperate experiment. It was a weapon, a system, a shift in how air combat itself could be fought. And as he turned back toward the carrier, knowing this was only the beginning of a much larger fight, one thing was clear in his mind with absolute certainty. The days of predictable losses were ending, and the sky, for the first time since the war began, no longer belonged entirely to the Zero. By June 23, 1942, the sky over the Pacific had already begun to change, but not in a way that favored only one side, because war never stays one-sided for long, and the Japanese pilots who had once dominated every engagement were not blind to what was happening, they were not careless, and they were certainly not incapable of learning. And as Fighting Squadron 3 moved into position near Santa Cruz Island that morning, flying 8 Wildcats in 4 disciplined pairs, maintaining spacing, altitude, and visual contact with a precision that had been drilled into them relentlessly over the past months, Thach felt something different in the air, not fear, not even tension, but anticipation. Because he knew that the enemy would not keep repeating the same mistakes. He knew that the weave had been seen, studied, and analyzed, and that meant only one thing. The next time they met the Zeros, the fight would not follow the same pattern. And as radar reports came in confirming 18 incoming aircraft approaching from the northwest, closing fast, higher altitude, tighter formation, the numbers alone told part of the story, but not all of it, because when the Zeros finally appeared overhead at 16,000 feet, they didn't dive immediately. They didn't commit the way they always had before. Instead, they circled, holding altitude, maintaining distance, observing, and that hesitation, that break from their usual aggressive doctrine, sent a clear message to Thach. They were thinking, they were planning, and most importantly, they were adapting. And as seconds stretched into nearly a full minute of aerial standoff, both sides maneuvering subtly, adjusting spacing, watching each other through canopies and reflections of sunlight on metal wings, the battlefield became something more than just speed and firepower. It became a contest of understanding, of who had learned faster, of who could anticipate the other's next move. And then it happened, not as a chaotic dive, but as a coordinated maneuver so precise it almost looked rehearsed. Because the Zeros didn't attack as one group, they split into 3 distinct elements, 6 breaking left, 6 breaking right, and 6 holding high. And in that moment, the entire logic of the weave was challenged, because the tactic had been designed to counter a single directional threat, to force an attacker into a predictable crossing point. But now the threat was coming from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing choices, forcing hesitation, forcing potential breakdowns in coordination. And as the first wave dove from above, while the flanking groups closed in from both sides, the sky became a 3-dimensional trap, and for the first time since developing the weave, Thach saw the possibility of its failure unfolding in real time, because his pilots, trained to turn toward their wingmen, suddenly had to decide which threat to prioritize, and that split-second uncertainty began to fracture the formation, one pair turning to counter the high group, another reacting to the right flank, another drifting slightly out of alignment. And just like that, the clean, synchronized pattern that had saved them before began to unravel, not completely, not instantly, but enough to create openings. And in aerial combat, even the smallest opening could be fatal. And Thach saw it happening, saw the structure collapsing into individual engagements. Exactly what the Japanese wanted, exactly what the weave was meant to prevent. And without hesitation, without panic, he keyed his radio with a force that cut through the chaos, ordering his pilots to reform, to ignore the multiple threats, to lock back onto their wingmen no matter what, because the strength of the weave was not in reacting to every danger, but in maintaining the pattern itself. And as the Zeros closed in from 3 directions, guns ready, angles tightening, the outcome of the next few seconds would determine whether the weave was just a temporary advantage or a lasting evolution in combat. Because if it failed here under pressure against an adapting enemy, then everything built on it would collapse with it. And as Thach turned hard, forcing his aircraft back into a with his wingman committing fully to the principle that had brought them this far, the sky once again became a place where geometry, timing, and trust would decide who lived and who didn't. What followed in the next 8 minutes wasn't just a dogfight. It was a test of whether discipline could overcome chaos, because even as the Zeros pressed their 3-directional assault, diving, banking, and accelerating with the same lethal precision that had made them so feared, the Wildcats began to stabilize, not by chasing every incoming threat, but by re-establishing the weave exactly as it was designed. Each pair locking into its rhythm, turning toward each other, crossing paths, creating zones of mutual protection that forced the attacking Zeros into impossible choices. Because now, instead of facing isolated targets, they were confronting moving intersections of firepower. And the first real proof came when one of the high-diving Zeros committed fully to a tail chase, ignoring the crossing pattern just long enough to try and secure a kill. But as it followed its target into the weave, another Wildcat cut across at precisely the right moment, guns blazing, rounds striking with devastating accuracy. And the Zero didn't have time to react, didn't have time to break. It simply disintegrated midair, marking the first loss in what was supposed to be a coordinated counterattack. And that moment sent a ripple through the Japanese formation, because even though their strategy was sound in theory, even though attacking from multiple angles should have broken the pattern, the execution was being undermined by the very thing they underestimated: the consistency of the American pilots, the refusal to abandon the weave even under pressure. And as the second and third engagements unfolded, the same pattern repeated itself. Zeros attempting to isolate targets, Wildcats refusing to separate, crossing again and again, forcing disengagements, forcing mistakes, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the momentum of the battle began to shift, because every second the Wildcats survived was a second the Zeros were losing energy, losing position, losing the clean advantages they relied on. And when another Zero attempted a flanking attack only to fly directly into the firing line of a crossing Wildcat, erupting into flames as it spiraled downward, the psychological balance tipped even further, because now the Japanese pilots weren't just dealing with a new tactic. They were dealing with a tactic that punished aggression itself, that turned their strength into vulnerability. And as the fight continued, the once coordinated 3-directional attack began to fragment, individual Zeros breaking formation, trying to adapt on their own. But in doing so, losing the very coordination that made their strategy effective. And one by one, the advantages slipped away until the engagement no longer favored them. And after 8 relentless minutes of maneuvering, firing, crossing, and surviving, the Zeros made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. They disengaged, climbing away, retreating from a fight where they still held numerical superiority but no longer held control. And as silence slowly returned to the sky, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the fading trails of smoke where aircraft had fallen, Thach took a moment to absorb what had just happened, not as a victory in the traditional sense, but as proof of something far more important: that the weave didn't just work against predictable enemies, it worked against adaptive ones. The core principle held, even when the opponent studied it, countered it, and attacked it from multiple angles. The core principle held, and that meant the future of air combat had fundamentally changed, because from this point forward, no pilot flying a Wildcat would have to rely on luck or outdated doctrine alone. They would have a system, a method, a way to fight back against an enemy that once seemed unbeatable. And as Thach guided his aircraft back toward base, knowing reports would be written, analyzed, and eventually turned into official orders, One realization stayed with him above all else. This wasn't the end of the evolution, it was just the beginning. Because the enemy would continue to adapt, the battles would grow larger, and the stakes would only increase. But now, for the first time, American pilots weren't just surviving the sky, they were starting to control it. By July 7th, 1942, the Pacific sky had become something entirely different from what it had been just months earlier. Not safer, not calmer, but transformed into a place where survival no longer depended purely on luck or raw aircraft performance. And as 12 American Wildcats from 6 different squadrons climbed into combat air patrol over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the reality of that transformation was about to be tested in the most unforgiving way possible, because this wasn't a controlled engagement. This wasn't a planned demonstration of tactics. This was chaos waiting to happen. A mixed formation of pilots with different levels of training, different experiences, and most critically, different knowledge of the one tactic that was beginning to redefine air combat, because out of those 12 pilots, only 4 had been trained in the weave. Only 4 understood how to turn toward each other instead of away, how to trust another aircraft with their lives in the middle of a high-speed fight, and the other 8, though skilled and experienced in their own right, were still operating under the old doctrine, the old instincts, the old belief that survival came from individual maneuvering rather than coordinated movement. And at 11:20 a.m., when 32 Japanese Zeros appeared from the northern horizon in a massive formation that blotted sections of the sky with shifting silver shapes, the imbalance wasn't just numerical, it was conceptual. Because those 12 Wildcats were not fighting as one unit, they were about to split into 2 entirely different approaches to combat. And the moment the Zeros dove, engines screaming, sunlight flashing off wings as they committed to the attack with overwhelming force, the separation became immediate. The 4 trained pilots instinctively paired up, tightening their formation, initiating the weave with practiced precision even as the enemy closed in from multiple angles, while the other 8 broke apart, scattering into individual engagements, turning hard, climbing, diving, doing everything they had been trained to do for years, everything that had once been considered correct. And for a brief moment, both approaches existed side by side in the same sky. A living comparison of old versus new, instinct versus innovation, and then the results began to unfold with brutal clarity, because the Zeros, recognizing isolated targets almost instantly, ignored the weaving pairs and focused their attacks on the lone Wildcats, diving aggressively, locking onto tails, executing the same lethal pattern that had defined the early months of the war. And one by one, the consequences appeared. A Wildcat breaking hard, left only to have a Zero match its turn and slide into firing position. Another attempting a climb only to stall under pressure and become an easy target, machine gun fire tearing through wings and fuselages, aircraft trailing smoke, spiraling downward, and within minutes the sky was marked by falling debris and parachutes. The cost of fighting alone becoming visible in the most unforgiving way possible, while just a few hundred yards away, the weaving pairs told a completely different story, because every time a Zero committed to an attack, it found itself crossing into the line of fire of another Wildcat. Every time it tried to isolate a target, that target turned toward its partner, forcing a choice that the Zero pilots were increasingly unwilling to make: continue the chase and risk destruction, or break off and lose the opportunity. And as the minutes stretched into a relentless 22-minute engagement, the contrast became undeniable. 6 Wildcats were shot down, every single one belonging to the group that fought independently, while the 4 pilots executing the weave not only survived but maintained control of their engagements, damaging and destroying multiple Zeros in the process. And when the battle finally ended, when the remaining Japanese aircraft pulled away and the surviving Wildcats regrouped over the battered but still operational Henderson Field, the lesson was no longer theoretical. It was written in loss and survival, in who came back and who didn't. And as reports were compiled and sent up the chain of command, there was no room left for hesitation, no space for skepticism. Because the evidence was overwhelming, the weave was not just effective, it was essential, and the cost of not using it was measured in lives lost in a single engagement. And that realization moved faster than any official order ever could, spreading through squadrons, through carriers, through every corner of the Pacific theater where American pilots were still fighting for control of the sky, because now the choice was clear: adapt or die. And for the first time since the war began, adaptation was not only possible, it was already proving itself in combat. In the weeks that followed Guadalcanal, the spread of the weave transformed from a gradual adoption into something closer to a necessity-driven evolution, because no pilot who had seen the results firsthand could ignore them, and no commander who had read the reports could justify delaying its implementation. And as training programs accelerated across the Pacific, from carriers to island airstrips to forward operating bases carved out of jungle terrain, the process of teaching the weave became relentless, almost obsessive, because it wasn't enough to understand the concept. Pilots had to feel it, had to execute it instinctively under pressure, had to trust it even when every instinct told them to break away. And John Thach himself became central to that effort, moving between units, conducting briefings, standing in front of chalkboards, drawing the same intersecting lines over and over again, explaining the geometry, the timing, the necessity of discipline, and then taking to the air to demonstrate it, flying side by side with pilots who were still learning, guiding them through the turns, the crossings, the reversals, until the pattern became second nature. And as more and more pilots mastered the tactic, its impact began to show not just in individual engagements, but in overall combat statistics, because before its adoption, American fighters had been operating at a severe disadvantage, losing aircraft at rates that threatened long-term sustainability. But after the weave became widespread, those numbers began to shift in a way that could not be ignored. Kill-to-loss ratios improving, survival rates increasing, and perhaps most importantly, confidence returning to pilots who had previously entered combat expecting the worst. And that psychological shift proved just as important as the tactical one, because a pilot who believed he could survive fought differently than one who believed he was already doomed. And that difference began to manifest in every engagement, in the way formations held together, in the way attacks were executed, in the way enemy aircraft were challenged rather than avoided. And the Japanese pilots noticed it, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, through radio reports, through debriefings, through the growing realization that the Americans were no longer fighting the same way, that they were no longer predictable, no longer easy to isolate, no longer guaranteed kills in turning engagements. And as attempts were made to counter the weave, to develop new tactics to regain the advantage, the fundamental problem remained, because the weave wasn't just a maneuver, it was a system that adapted with the pilots using it. A flexible approach that could be applied in different situations, modified under pressure, and maintained even as the enemy changed their methods. And that adaptability made it incredibly difficult to defeat, because it wasn't static. It evolved in real time, shaped by experience, refined through combat, and reinforced by the shared understanding among pilots that their survival depended on maintaining it. And as months passed and the war in the Pacific intensified, the weave became more than just a tactic. It became doctrine, formalized in orders, standardized in training manuals, required in every fighter squadron operating in the theater, and its influence extended beyond the Wildcat itself. Because other aircraft began to adopt similar principles, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, even bomber formations incorporating elements of mutual support and crossing coverage into their defensive strategies, and the results continued to validate the approach. Engagements that would have once resulted in heavy losses now ending with American aircraft returning home, damaged perhaps, but intact, pilots alive who would have otherwise been statistics. And by late 1942, the shift was undeniable. The sky over the Pacific was no longer dominated by a single aircraft or a single doctrine. It had become a contested space where innovation had leveled the playing field, where a simple idea born from desperation had grown into a defining element of aerial warfare. And as John Thach continued to train, to teach, to refine what he had started with nothing more than a pack of matches and a determination to stop losing men, the true scale of what he had created began to emerge, not just in numbers or reports, but in the faces of the pilots who returned from missions they should not have survived, in the stories shared in ready rooms and briefings, in the quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed, that survival was no longer a matter of chance but of knowledge, discipline, and trust. And as the war pushed forward into even larger and more complex battles, one thing remained constant across every squadron that had embraced the weave: the simple, unshakable principle that two aircraft, moving together, could achieve what one alone never could. And in a war defined by overwhelming odds and constant danger, that principle didn't just change outcomes, it saved lives on a scale that few could have imagined when it all began. By early 1943, the Pacific sky no longer belonged to a single aircraft or a single nation. It had become a proving ground where survival depended not just on machines or firepower, but on ideas. And among those ideas, one stood apart not because it was complex or technologically advanced, but because it was simple, repeatable, and built on something deeper than engineering. It was built on trust. And as the months passed following the brutal battles of 1942, the tactic that had once been dismissed as unconventional, even reckless, had become standard doctrine across the United States Navy, spreading from carrier groups to island airstrips, from seasoned squadrons to newly trained pilots who had never known a time when the weave didn't exist. And with that spread came a transformation that could be measured not just in victories but in survival rates. Because before its adoption, American pilots had entered combat knowing that facing a zero often meant fighting a battle already lost. But now they entered with something else entirely: a method, a system, a way to counter an enemy that had once seemed unbeatable. And that shift in mindset changed everything, because war is not only fought with weapons but with belief. And belief in survival is one of the most powerful forces a pilot can carry into the sky. And as engagement after engagement played out across the Pacific, the numbers began to tell a story that could no longer be ignored. Kill-to-loss ratios that had once heavily favored the Japanese began to balance, then shift. And by late 1942 and into 1943, American pilots were not only surviving more often, they were winning more often, not because their aircraft had suddenly become superior, but because their tactics had evolved, because they had learned to fight as pairs, as units, as interconnected elements rather than isolated individuals. And that evolution didn't just impact the Wildcat, it spread to other aircraft, to other branches, to other theaters, influencing how fighter combat was approached on a broader scale. And at the center of that transformation was a man who never set out to become a symbol, never sought recognition or legacy, but simply wanted to solve a problem that was killing his pilots. And John Thach, now recognized not just as a squadron commander but as a tactician whose ideas had reshaped aerial combat, found himself pulled away from the front lines, reassigned not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded too well, because command understood that his greatest value was no longer in the cockpit alone but in the classrooms, the briefings, the training programs where new generations of pilots could learn what he had discovered. And though he accepted those orders, there was a part of him that never left the sky, a part that remained with men still flying combat missions, still facing the same dangers he had once faced, but now doing so with a better chance of coming home. And as he stood in front of groups of young aviators demonstrating the same crossing patterns with simple objects, drawing the same diagrams, explaining the same principles over and over again, the impact of his work continued to grow, because every pilot he trained carried that knowledge into the air. Every pilot who survived passed it on. And slowly, almost quietly, the weave became more than just a tactic. It became a culture, a shared understanding among pilots that survival was not an individual effort, but a collective one, that in the chaos of combat, your life was tied to the pilot flying beside you. And that realization created bonds that went beyond standard military discipline, bonds built on trust, on coordination, on the knowledge that when the moment came, when a Zero or any enemy aircraft locked onto your tail, someone would be there, crossing your path, covering your blind spot, giving you a chance that didn't exist before. And as the war continued and new aircraft entered service, faster, more powerful, more advanced, the core principle remained unchanged, because no matter how technology evolved, the idea that two aircraft working together could overcome a superior opponent remained as relevant as it had been on that February morning in 1942, and by the time the war began to turn decisively in favor of the Allies, the weave had already secured its place as one of the most important tactical innovations of the conflict, not because it ended the war on its own, but because it changed how the war was fought in the air, and in doing so, It changed how many pilots lived to see its end. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the world looked different, the skies quieter, the constant threat replaced by a fragile peace. But for the pilots who had lived through those years, the memories remained as vivid as ever. The sound of engines, the flash of gunfire, the split-second decisions that determined life or death. And among those memories, one pattern stood out, not just as a maneuver but as a turning point, something that had given them a chance when they had none. And as they returned home to families, to lives interrupted and now resumed, many carried with them a quiet understanding that they were there because of something simple, something almost impossible to explain to those who hadn't been there, that two aircraft crossing paths at the right moment could mean the difference between life and death. And for John Thach, the end of the war did not mark the end of his mission, because while others stepped away from military life, he remained, continuing to serve, continuing to teach, continuing to refine the principles that had already saved so many, rising through the ranks over the years, not because of ambition, but because of impact, because his contributions extended beyond any single battle or campaign. And as new conflicts emerged, as new generations of pilots took to the skies in different aircraft under different conditions, the influence of his work persisted, adapted for higher speeds, for jet engines, for entirely new forms of combat, but always rooted in the same fundamental idea: coordination over isolation, trust over instinct. And even decades later, during conflicts like Korea and Vietnam, pilots would find themselves in situations not entirely different from those faced in 1942, facing aircraft that could outmaneuver them in certain conditions. And once again, the answer would not come from trying to match the enemy's strengths, but from applying a system that forced the enemy into disadvantage. And though the names of the aircraft had changed, though the speeds had increased, the principle remained the same. A legacy carried forward not in textbooks alone, but in practice, in the lived experiences of those who relied on it. And as the years passed and Thach eventually retired, leaving behind decades of service, he did so not as a man seeking recognition, but as one who had fulfilled a responsibility, one who had seen a problem and refused to accept it as inevitable. And in the quiet years that followed, away from the intensity of war and training, the full scope of what he had accomplished became clearer. Not in medals or official citations, but in numbers that spoke louder than any award ever could. Because in the months before the weave was introduced, losses had been devastating, pilots falling in numbers that seemed unsustainable. But in the months and years after, those losses decreased dramatically, thousands of lives preserved not through chance but through a deliberate change in how combat was approached. And it is estimated that over 2,000 American pilots survived situations they would not have survived without the weave. 2,000 men who returned home, who lived full lives, who raised families, who became part of a future that would not have existed without that single idea. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of the story, not the battles, not the victories, not even the innovation itself, but the ripple effect it created. Because every life saved extended beyond the individual, into families, into communities, into generations that followed. And even today, long after the war has passed into history, the weave continues to be taught, not as an outdated relic, but as a foundational principle of aerial combat, adapted for modern aircraft, for new technologies, but still grounded in the same truth that John Thach discovered with two simple matchsticks, that survival in the air is not about being the fastest or the strongest. It is about understanding, about adapting, about working together in a way that turns vulnerability into strength. And as long as pilots continue to take to the skies, as long as they face uncertainty, danger, and the need to outthink an opponent, that lesson will remain, a quiet but enduring reminder that sometimes the most powerful innovations are not born from complexity, but from the determination to keep people alive. And in that sense, the legacy of the weave is not just a story from World War II, it is a living principle. One that continues to echo through every aircraft that flies in formation, every pilot who trusts the one beside them, and every moment where two paths cross in the sky, not by chance but by design, ensuring that more pilots come home than ever before.